Hey everyone, it's Synth Designer back again with another video. Today I want to talk about how to create a song using one chord progression and just getting the most out of that chord progression. I know for beginners it can be difficult to envision how to get from just chords to bass to arpeggios to melodies, etc. and getting different sections and arranging the song. And I want to show you how you could go from one chord progression on the piano like this to a full arranged mix like this. So as you can see here, this is pretty much a complete arrangement. Obviously, there are different sections like verses and choruses, and there's other elements that would go into a song, but as you can see, the core elements are all here. You have kind of an intro, a little build-up, a drop, and these are all built on that one chord progression that I showed you at the very beginning. So as we can see here, let's go back to that original chord progression in the piano, and let's just take a look at the chords. So when you're setting up chords, I like to just play with basic major and minor chords and then work my way from there. So here we can see we have a basic E minor chord progression, and you might be thinking, okay, how do I tell that? Well, I set this up originally basically like this, where these middle notes were all here. And then all I did was just take these middle notes and move them up an octave, and that kind of gives you a little bit of separation. And if we were just to play this as basic notes here, take this out, just play this pattern. It sounds totally fine, but you're trying to make something a little bit more interesting. So as you saw before, I had this B note as well. And this is just to add what's called a pedal tone. And this is kind of just settling in here and giving us a little bit more flavor and color. Again, we want to just make things a little bit more interesting. And so let's just put these up an octave like we had. It just makes it a little bit lighter. And in a lot of ways, you just saw how you can make one chord progression different in a lot of ways. We didn't settle for the same basic non-inverted chords. As you can see, we have an inversion now with the third being up an octave, as well as this pedal tone. So these are just basics of how you can set up chords, but let's get into more of how we set up the others as well. So if we were to go to pattern 2, this kind of sudden break from this piano to this kind of basic pad. You can think of a lot of EDM tracks here where you're moving from a kind of basic piano to a kind of soft pad where you could imagine some vocals come in here. So this pad here is from Dreamscape Sounds. If you're not familiar with my preset packs, they're all free at synthdesigner.com. This one has 50 unique sounds in it. And this preset pack is really meant to be used for all genres. Let's listen to the sound here. A nice basic warm pad with a saw wave and a sine wave, a little bit of reverb. And it continues here, right? And if we were to take a look at the chord progression again, all I did here was just copy and paste the chords. But of course, it gives you another kind of texture and component here to have them used in a pad. If we go back to pattern 2, this is another sound from Dreamscape Sounds called the Bouncy Saw. So let's listen to this. And I used the LFO here with a quarter rate here. Gives it that kind of bouncy element to it when you attach it to the cutoff, right? It's essentially a repeating loop. So it kind of gives it that bounciness. It's just a basic saw here with a little bit of reverb and delay. And it comes in here. So it kind of gives us, again, that new texture, that new component. Whereas we have the saw before with the basic pad. Now we have kind of this bouncy element, and we can introduce all three at once here. Even though we have one basic chord progression that are copied all over, as you can see, you have three different elements. The pad here is giving us that warmth, that kind of background element. The bounciness is really coming through and being kind of that forward element, and the piano adds that transient and also more of that warmth that we would want. Then we introduce a new element here, which is similar to the last one, and as you can see, it's basically the same chord progression again with pattern 4, and all I did here was just change the rate. So I changed it to 1/8, and that kind of increases the tension. So with a very basic change here of a quarter to an eighth note rate, we kind of increase the tension. So we did nothing new there other than changing the rate of the LFO, and it gives us a whole new kind of quality and movement to the song. Then pattern 5, this is where we establish a bass line. So let's check it out here. When you're establishing a bass line, you have a whole bunch of different options. I made it super simple. I used the basic Reese from Dreamscape Sounds. Again, this is a simple sound here. As you may be noticing, there is that bounce to it, and I just used Kickstart 2 here. Use any sidechain plugin you want. You can also even use Serum. You know, if you're familiar with Serum, you can use the sidechain options here, and that will give you that same bounce, or similar at least. And how do I form that? Well, going back to our original chords, if we were to take a look at the pattern here, it's just E, C, A, and B. And as you can imagine, these are just the root notes from our chords. So using our very same first chord, we came up with a basic bass line here. And since it's a Reese bass, it's going to be sustained, and it's going to be sitting underneath that entire mix. So let's listen to those sections now. So again, we have 5 different patterns based off of that. Moving over to pattern 6 here, and we also include a couple of other items. Let's take a look at pattern 6 real quick. It's this kind of bouncy, kind of delayed sound. It's meant to add a little bit more transience. You can probably turn this down a little bit. I called it the lead arp. It's really not that, but if we take a look at it, it's another sound from Dreamscape Sounds called Glassy Square Lead Pluck, and it's got that really nice transient element to it that just gives us a little bit of texture as well. Pattern 7 now is when we start to get a little bit more unique, but again, it's based off of our original chord progression. This is called Distorted Square Pluck. This is where we introduce the lead, and as you can see, I added some automation here. As we're building up into this drop, there's this uplifter as well. Kind of a basic EDM drop here. going into it. And we don't want to introduce this sound all at once, so we're filtering it off and opening up that filter. So pattern 7, how do we make such kind of like a bouncy ARP lead type of thing? Well, if we were to take a look at the pattern, again, you can see that these are simply the chords that we used, that we came up with. And I kind of played around with the notes. I want something very basic here, but something that worked for all the chords, because we saw that all the chords were moving. But if you keep it within your scale, then you can use basically whatever notes you want as long as you're within that scale. So we have just basic E, G, and D. These really just are simple notes that belong within that scale. When we look at something like pattern 6 here, you can see that E, G, and D are kind of all over the place and will fit basically over anything. So if we were just to take the pad, for example, and this little setup here, then we'll be able to hear that this progression works well. So we have several sections here. The only time we really moved away from the basic chords was this newest pattern. But as I said, if you take a look at the notes, you can use basically the same notes you used from the chords and just create a nice repeatable pattern here. And then we move into this drop, and pattern 10 is basically the same as pattern 7. It's just a new version of it that it is a different octave. So if we were to play them together, actually I think it's the same octave. It's just that I put some OTT on this one, so this is a free plugin. This really adds just a lot more compression sound. So if I were to take it off, so as you can see, it really just adds that kind of color to it. So we have the basic setup there again. We add a couple new elements, so pattern 8 and 9 here. Pattern 8, as you can see, very familiar chords, the same chord setup, but now with a little bit of a bounce to it. So let's just listen. Same piano sound. You can change up the piano sound. You can make it a little bit different or the same, but the pattern is really what makes it different. These kind of bouncy chords here. And then we go to pattern 9 here, and we have the super saw again from Dreamscape Sounds. I highly encourage you to go and download Dreamscape Sounds since it's free and you'll get all these sounds there. So let's listen to this one. I think if you're familiar with any EDM genre, you'll have heard the super saw sound, and that adds that very distinctive bounce to it, and OTT again to give it that compressed sound. And if we go back to the piano, we can even add some kickstart to it here. Actually, I have the piano on this same channel here. I wouldn't do that if you're building a full song, but just for the sake of this, it's already on kickstart, so So as you can see, these basic chords really gave us basically the whole song here, and then I just added some basic drums here with another loop. But I really want to show you could basically create a whole song just off of one chord progression with just some minor tweaks and variations. Obviously, at that point, you have to create and pick the sounds that you want, but your basic fundamental elements are all there with your bass, your ARP, your leads, your chords, all from that original chord progression. Let me know down in the comments if you felt like I missed something here and that something wasn't clear. I would really love to get into it more if that's what you wanted to hear and learn more about. But I think the big takeaway here is don't overcomplicate things. Come up with one chord progression that you really like and build off of that. You can come up with a million different ways of how you want the song to be arranged, and the vibe of it will change. This principle really applies to any genre, so don't be afraid to use it in whatever kind of music you create. The one thing I also didn't mention is by using this one chord progression, you can also go into something, no matter what sound it is, and you can just use your arpeggiator in the DAW and play around with that. So if we were just to turn this on, it's a little fast, I think. And as simple as that, you could create some cool patterns here. Feel free to play around with them. So you could do a lot of things with just basic chord progressions, and don't be too concerned with creating all sorts of wild chords for your production when you can create a great song using just one chord progression. So I hope you all enjoyed this video, and I'll see you all next time.